Somebody should take you out of context and say you call me white trash. He did not. I call myself.
For most of her career, Marlene Cash had been called many things: a survivor, a songwriter, a symbol of an entire region's pride. But never once, in 4 decades of interviews, had anyone accused her of losing her composure on camera. That reputation was so well established that producers booking her for live television rarely worried about surprises. Marlene was the safe choice, the guest who could turn even the most awkward silence into something warm. So when she agreed to appear on the daytime panel show Round Table Live, nobody expected the hour to end the way it did. The show had built its identity on unscripted friction. For hosts sat behind a long curved desk, trading opinions on the news of the day, occasionally sparring with each other for the audience's amusement. Of the 4, Renata Cole was the one viewers tuned in for. She had a gift for asking the question nobody else would, and an even greater gift for making that question sound like curiosity rather than confrontation. Producers loved her for it. Guests, less so. When Marlene walked out from behind the curtain that afternoon, the studio audience rose to their feet before she even reached her chair. She waved, laughed at something one of the front row fans shouted, and settled into her seat with the practiced ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times. The interview began exactly the way everyone expected. She talked about her latest album, about the charity she'd started years ago to fund music programs in schools that had lost their arts budgets, about growing up with very little, and how that shaped the way she saw the world. Her answers were warm, unhurried, occasionally funny. The audience ate it up. It was 12 minutes in when Renata leaned forward, resting her chin on laced fingers, and asked the question that would end up defining the segment. Marlene, you've been in the public eye for, 40 years now? And your look, your persona, it really hasn't changed at all in that time. Why do you think that is? It was a fair question on its surface, and Marlene answered it the way she always did, with a story about knowing who she was early in life and deciding a long time ago not to apologize for it. But Renata wasn't satisfied. She pressed further, suggesting that maybe the unchanging image wasn't really about self-knowledge so much as a costume that had simply stopped being questioned. She wondered aloud whether the exaggerated glamour Marlene was known for, the big silhouettes, the sparkle, the theatrical femininity, might read differently to a younger generation. Maybe even as something a little hollow. The room's temperature dropped by a few degrees. The other 3 hosts went quiet, the kind of quiet that comes when everyone senses a shift, but nobody wants to be the one who names it. Marlene, for her part, didn't flinch. She tilted her head slightly, the same gesture she'd used in interviews for decades when she wanted a moment to choose her words carefully. I've never thought there was anything to be ashamed of in looking the way I look, she said. Femininity, glamour, whatever you want to call it, that's never been the opposite of strength for me. It's just been one way of showing it. Renata wasn't done. She asked whether Marlene worried that young women watching might absorb the wrong lesson, that being taken seriously required spectacle, required glitter, required performing a version of womanhood designed to be looked at. The question hung in the air a beat too long before Marlene answered. I think young women are a lot smarter than that, she said evenly. I trust them to figure out what works for them a lot more than I trust anybody's labels, including mine. The audience applauded, and for a moment it looked as though the exchange might settle into something more comfortable. It didn't. Renata leaned back, arms folding across her chest, and said almost conversationally, You've built a brand around that image, though. And brands have a way of covering up substance. Something in the room shifted at that remark. It wasn't the words alone, it was the tone underneath them, the sense that this had stopped being an interview and become something closer to an audit. Marlene's fingers, which had been resting lightly against the arm of her chair, went still. What followed over the next several minutes was unlike anything the show's regular viewers had seen. Renata's questions came faster, sharper, each one framed as though it were simply following the thread of the last, though the thread had clearly become a rope meant to bind. She suggested that Marlene had spent a career selling a fantasy so convincingly that people forgot to ask who was underneath it. She said the persona wasn't authenticity. It was marketing dressed up as folksy wisdom. She implied that decades of kindness on camera might just be a strategy for avoiding real scrutiny. Marlene didn't raise her voice. If anything, her voice got quieter, more level, more deliberate, the tone of someone who has decided that calm is the sharpest tool available to her. "Renata," she said, "you keep talking like you've got me figured out. And I think what you're really hoping is that I'll lose my temper so you can feel like you were right about something." It was the first moment all afternoon where Renata didn't have an immediate comeback. The silence stretched half a second too long before she recovered, insisting she was simply asking the questions other people were too polite to ask. Marlene told her, without any edge in her voice at all, that there was a difference between asking a hard question and using a segment to dismantle someone in front of an audience for entertainment. "One more like that," she added, "and you and I are going to be having a very different conversation." Renata straightened in her chair, unwilling to be the one who backed down first. She pushed harder, accusing Marlene of hiding behind a reputation people were too fond to challenge, of getting a pass, because she was likable, because she smiled easily and spoke softly, when likability, she said, was never supposed to be a shield against examination. She went further still, suggesting that the image Marlene had spent her life cultivating quietly told women that being decorative was the price of being accepted. The studio had gone almost completely silent by then, the kind of silence that has weight to it. Marlene adjusted her jacket, a small, unhurried gesture, and said that no one, not a network, not a critic, not a fellow host on a panel show, got to decide unilaterally what empowerment looked like for another woman. Renata told her to spare the speech. Marlene answered that it wasn't a speech. It was a boundary, and boundaries were things she'd learned to set a long time ago, usually right around the point where someone stopped speaking with her and started speaking at her. When Renata tried to interrupt, Marlene lifted a hand, not dramatically, just enough to hold the floor, and said she had stayed this long because she kept hoping the conversation might eventually turn into something worth having. It was a quiet sentence, almost gentle in delivery, and it landed harder than anything sharp could have. Renata's composure, so carefully maintained until that point, cracked for just a moment. She accused Marlene of being dramatic. Marlene replied that people usually reached for that word right when they'd lost control of a conversation they thought they were steering. Renata stood up. The chair scraped audibly against the studio floor, a sound that seemed to echo far longer than it should have. She said she wasn't going to sit there and be accused of bullying a guest on her own show. Marlene, still seated, still calm, said that was exactly the problem. Not that it was Renata's show, but that Renata seemed to believe hosting it meant she couldn't be told when she'd gone too far. "You don't get to lecture me," Renata snapped. "No," Marlene agreed, "I don't. But I do get to decide what I'm willing to sit through." The other three hosts sat frozen, none of them willing to intervene, none of them sure an intervention would help. Backstage, according to people who worked on the production that day, the control room had gone from calm to chaos in under a minute. Floor managers were signaling frantically for a commercial break that no one greenlit in time. Camera operators didn't know where to point, toward Renata's rising anger or Marlene's unervingly steady stillness. The audio team kept their hands hovering over the faders, waiting for a shout that never actually came, because Marlene never once raised her voice through any of it. Marlene set her coffee mug down gently on the desk in front of her, the kind of small, deliberate motion people make when they've already decided something and are simply giving their body time to catch up with their mind. She said she'd come to the show that day to talk about music and literacy and hope not to be picked apart for a segment. She thanked the other hosts for having her, said she was sorry it had turned out this way, and told Renata, quite simply, that they were done. Renata tried to get the last word, insisting they weren't finished. That walking away, now, was Marlene running from a hard conversation. Marlene turned back toward her one final time. "Tough conversations and disrespect aren't the same thing," she said. "I came for one. You gave me the other." Then she unclipped her microphone, set it down beside the mug with the same unhurried care, and walked off the set. For a moment, nobody moved. Then, in a turn almost no one in the room anticipated, Renata herself stood, straightened her blazer, and walked off in the opposite direction, without a word to the remaining hosts or the stunned audience. 2 hosts left the desk in the span of 90 seconds, and the show cut to commercial 3 minutes late, well after whatever version of the segment had been planned had ceased to exist. The clip was online within the hour. By evening it had been cut, captioned, and re-uploaded across every platform where people gather to relive a moment they weren't in the room for. Commentary split almost immediately along predictable lines. One camp argued that Renata had crossed a line that hosts on shows built around debate are supposed to know exists, that pushing a guest toward humiliation isn't the same thing as pushing them toward honesty, and that walking off her own set afterward looked less like principle and more like an inability to handle the consequences of her own questions. The other camp defended her, pointing out that uncomfortable questions are the entire premise of the format, and that Marlene's calm might have simply been the practiced composure of someone who has spent a lifetime being underestimated because she smiles easily. What almost everyone agreed on, regardless of which side of the debate they landed on, was that Marlene's stillness throughout the exchange was the detail that stuck. She never matched the rising heat in the room. She never postured, never interrupted, never let her voice climb even a note higher than where it had started. In a format built around noise, her refusal to make any seem to unsettle the room more than shouting ever could have. Several television critics who wrote about the episode in the days that followed noted the same thing. That composure, deployed at the right moment, can look a great deal like power. Backstage sources who spoke about the incident afterward described a production team caught completely off guard, unable to find a natural break point in a conversation that kept refusing to de-escalate on its own. They described producers standing frozen at the edge of a studio floor, unsure whether stepping in would calm the situation or simply make a story about network interference, instead of a story about two people who had stopped agreeing on the terms of the conversation. Nobody wanted to be the one who called it. So nobody did, and the moment played out in full unedited, in front of a live audience that had shown up expecting an ordinary afternoon of television. In interviews given weeks later, Marlene addressed the moment only briefly, saying she had no regrets about how she'd handled herself, and that she'd learned a long time ago that dignity wasn't something you had to raise your voice to protect. She said she didn't view the exchange as a fight so much as a moment where she'd simply decided she was allowed to leave a conversation that had stopped being a conversation. She declined to say much more about Renata specifically, other than that she hoped they might speak again someday under better circumstances. Renata, for her part, gave a shorter, more guarded statement, acknowledging that the segment had gotten away from both of us, and that she still stood behind the substance of her questions, even if she might have chosen different words to ask them. The network issued no formal comment beyond confirming that both women remained welcome on the program, a line read by most observers as an attempt to close the story rather than resolve it. What lingered longest, for viewers who kept returning to the clip in the weeks that followed, wasn't really the argument itself. Arguments on live television are common enough that most fade from memory within a news cycle. What lingered was the picture of two very different ways of holding power in a room, one built on pressing until something breaks, the other built on refusing to break at all, and the fact that, on that particular afternoon, neither one gave an inch. In the end, both women left the same set within minutes of each other, for reasons that looked, from the outside, almost identical. Neither was willing to keep performing a version of the conversation she no longer believed in.